Okay, looks like I'm here.
Hi, Lydia.
Hey, Tom.
Good to see you.
What?
Good to see you mellowing
Good to
out and
see you.
everything.
Am I mellowing? Yeah, I know. I
Yeah,
said that.
that was
No,
the
I said
rumor.
trying. I said trying.
Such was the rumor.
Yes.
At any rate, yes.
Said I'm trying to mellow with age.
Yes, good luck to.
That was then. This is the next day. Now I'm no longer trying to. No. Temporarily trying.
Yeah.
I don't know how it's been over where you are, but it is cold here today. It literally was snowing.
We got a risk of snow tonight, but right now it's like 48 degrees out. Lots of wind.
I don't want that, man. Things are grumpy enough. We don't need grumpy weather. There's my.
You got a
better half.
question on text to you there, Lydia.
I do. What do I do? Click on chat or something here?
Yeah.
Is the white a symbol of mellowing? No, the white is a symbol of the fact that these looked like clothes that were simultaneously warm, comfortable, and decent looking. So not symbolic, it's literal. Literal. Narrative, I usually go for the literal meaning rather than the symbolic meaning.
There you go. I lost a
it's
light
not a literary device. No, it is not.
Whereas I am wearing black, and that's just black. There's no deeper meaning.
You would not believe how many black shirts Tim has. I mean, he has like many, many black shirts. I finally told him I have no idea where he wants them hung up or put away because they go in different places. He's just got to do it. And
did I object?
And he does it. He did not object. He did it. So, do we have a bunch of pre-submitted questions? I know Jonathan has mentioned a few to me. No?
I'm muted.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a few. We are also currently live streaming to YouTube, so people can tune in there as well, and also submit questions in the live chat on YouTube. For those of you who are on Zoom, you can submit questions via the Q&A button, which should be, I think, at the top of your screen. And we will do our best to respond. You can submit questions anonymously if you wish. This evening we're dealing with the evidences for the resurrection, so trying to keep questions on topic pertaining to that or to Holy Week in general. Let's maybe, before we dive into questions, maybe just give a brief summary of some of the basic evidences for the resurrection for those of the audience who perhaps aren't very acquainted with this topic. Does any of you particularly want to dive into summarize some of that?
I'll take a whack at it. There's really a lot, and that's the surprising thing. But I think something that I want to stress is that testimonial evidence is not just one thing, any more than books are just one thing. The evidence of testimony comes in a variety of textures and strengths, and it can be compounded, and we can examine the way that different people offering testimonial evidence intersect with one another, the way their testimonies interlock or fail to interlock. And I am very impressed by the fact that not only do we have people saying, yes, this happened, but the stories they tell integrate in fascinating ways, which really are the kinds of ways that people giving testimony today to things that they've witnessed integrate when we see the testimonies come together. And I'm sure we'll get into examples of that. But I would just like to start out by saying testimonial evidence isn't just one thing, and we have to look at the texture of it. We have to look at the details of it in order to appreciate how strong that evidence is. So yes, our best evidence of the resurrection, though not the only one, is the evidence of testimonies that we have in the Gospels and other places, but primarily in the Gospels. And there are some fascinating features of that evidence.
Absolutely. Anyone have anything to add to that?
I think what we find is that we have testimony of different kinds, and I think this is part of what Tim's getting at. We've got the testimony directly to the fact that Jesus was appearing to his disciples. We've got testimony to the empty tomb. We've got testimony to the conversion of Paul on the road to Emmaus, for example. So we've got testimony of a different kind to the change to Sunday worship. That's another thing. Now, in a sense, that comes to us testimonially. For example, that it was kind of abrupt, and we find references to it in so the Pauline epistles, for example, and I think Acts also refers to their meeting on the first day of the week, if I'm not mistaken. But it's in a sense, it's a different kind, it's a different vector of evidence, but all of this converges on the resurrection of Jesus on 3 days after he was killed on Good Friday. By the way, Jonathan, how did you get that great background? How did you do that?
If you go to the arrow next to stop video, the arrow to the right of stop video, you can choose a virtual background. You can upload a video or an image, and it will make it your background.
Wow, I gotta try that sometime. Not
Yeah.
tonight.
Yeah, I'm in Michigan now, if that makes you feel any better, McGrose.
Gee, it makes me feel so untech savvy, man.
Yeah. But northern Michigan, no less. Yeah, there's testimony even beyond the Gospels too. The very existence of the church, fact that from the very beginning it was a resurrection message that they were telling. There's no evidence of the church ever saying anything else, but we are a resurrection proclamation church, and the resurrection that they taught wasn't something that just came out of myth, didn't even come out of Jewish heritage, because the resurrection that Jesus exhibited wasn't the kind of thing that the Jews expected at that stage in our world's history. There's too many unexpected things that happened at the time of the resurrection that are only easily explainable by the resurrection.
The way that I tend to frame the argument is to say that there are four competing hypotheses, which I would maintain are mutually exhaustive. Namely that...
Okay, that's disturbing.
Okay, so there are four mutually exhaustive hypotheses which would purport to explain the resurrection evidence. One is that the disciples or the apostles deliberately made up the story of the resurrection. So you've got the conspiracy hypothesis. One would be that they were honestly mistaken in believing that Jesus rose from the dead. Another hypothesis would be that actually the apostles themselves didn't claim that Jesus rose from the dead, and it's a later mythical or legendary developmental claim. And finally, the hypothesis which I myself entertain, which is that Jesus in fact did rise from the dead. And so we can adjudicate each of those four contending hypotheses on their respective merits. In terms of the hypothesis that the disciples were honestly mistaken, I think that is significantly militated against by numerous pieces of evidence. I'll just name one in particular, and that is that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul mentions that Jesus rose again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and it often puzzled me for quite a number of years as to why Jesus why Paul says that Jesus was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. I mean, there's passages in the Old Testament that speak about the fact that the Christ was to be raised. For example, in Isaiah 53 says that he would be cut off from the land of the living, and then he would prolong his days, and he would see his offspring, and the will of the Lord would prosper in his hand, and so forth, which seems to indicate a resurrection. But what about the 3 days? On the resurrection of the Christ on the third day. This is also, of course, alluded to in Luke 24 when Jesus opens the scriptures to the Emmaus disciples. And the context of 1 Corinthians 15 actually sheds some light on this. So in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul goes on to say that Christ is the first fruits of those that have fallen asleep, which, of course, points us back to Leviticus 23, where you have the institution of the feasts, the Jewish feasts. You've got the Passover, And then, according to Leviticus 23, the the Feast of First Fruits, which celebrates the first fruits of the harvest, was to be celebrated on the day following the first Sabbath following Passover, which would be the Sunday. And so then that gives some indication as to what Paul means when he says that Christ was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, because in that same immediate context, he's discussing the Feast of First Fruits. And of course, he also mentioned that Christ is the fulfillment of the Passover in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Now, there was a debate among the Pharisees and the Sadducees about whether the day following the Sabbath referred to the weekly Sabbath following Passover, or the Feast of Passover itself as being a kind of special Sabbath. The Pharisees took the view that it was the special Sabbath of Passover. The Sadducees, on the other hand, took the view that it was the day after the first Sabbath after Passover, the weekly Sabbath. But since the Sadducees were in charge of the temple in the first century, that was the view that prevailed in the first century. And so it's quite significant then, I think, because of the theological import, that Christ rose again on the third day, on the day of first fruits, which I think points to design either on the part of the human authors or on the part of God who supernaturally raises Jesus from the dead. And so I think that points in the direction away from the idea that the disciples were honestly mistaken. And there's other evidences as well that bear on that. And then we've got the remaining hypothesis, namely that they were deliberately setting out to deceive people, which there's numerous evidences against as well, such as the fact that they were willing to suffer persecutions and trials and even be martyred for that conviction. And so then cumulatively it points to the fourth explanation being the best explanation, namely that the disciples did experience Jesus risen from the dead, and they reported what had actually happened to them. And there's various evidences both from the Pauline corpus and also from the Gospels and Acts that in fact that was what the apostles were claiming. It wasn't some legendary development that evolved much later.
I wanted to talk about what you were saying about them being persecuted. And that's a very important line of evidence that requires us to zero in on the book of Acts in particular. When Tim debated Bart Ehrman on the Unbelievable show some years ago, I remember Bart said something like, well, they weren't, Tim can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is how I remember it, that Bart said they weren't exactly out there on the street corners saying that Jesus was risen from the dead. And Tim said that that's exactly what they were out there on the street corners saying, that Jesus was risen from the dead. And so from the book of Acts, we have a lot of evidence of this extremely early danger that they faced. And I think that's real important because sometimes you could have a situation where somebody would be, in a sense, trying it. You could have a deceiver who would say, you know, I'm going to try this and see if I can get away with it. He tries starting some kind of cult or something, and then maybe he kind of gets caught up in it, and maybe he even gets killed. I mean, we can imagine a scenario like that. Oh, I never really intended them to take it, you know, quite this far. There's a novel called Foucault's Pendulum, kind of a disturbing novel where these reporters do a hoax that they found the Philosopher's Stone that can turn lead into gold. And then there are these actual crazy cultists that actually believe in this. And so they believe the hoax, and they actually kill one of them, because they want him to tell them the secret of the Philosopher's Stone. And of course, he can't convince them that it's just a hoax. But because we have in the book of Acts that they knew right from the beginning that they didn't have anything to gain from this, that they weren't just going to get away with it or get, you know, pleasure or power or whatever from it, because the persecution began right away and was so early, then that militates against any kind of a liar hypothesis. So that's a line of evidence that we get from a document that's in the Bible, namely Acts, but just as an historical document to the backdrop of the very earliest development of Christianity.
And there's also the common trope that people die for a lie all the time. But what you don't have is people dying for a lie that they made up themselves. Maybe you've got a few exceptions in Jim Jones or David Koresh, but I don't know if they died for the lie in their case as much as they died for the pride. That's not what the disciples did. Koresh and Jones, they were committed to being the special person to the very end, I suspect. That's not what you see anything like that in the disciples. They were bondservants. They were humble. They were there for Christ, not themselves. There's nothing in common there. People do not die for lies they make up themselves.
And of course, the martyrdoms of Peter and James, the Lord's brother, are especially well attested. For many of the apostles, we don't really know for certain exactly how they died. Many of the sources are later, second, third century, and clearly subject to legendary embellishment. In the case, though, of Peter, we have two first century sources which mention his martyrdom. One of them being Clement of Rome, who wrote around, most scholars date it around AD 96, when he wrote a letter to the church in Corinth. And he mentions in passing in section 5 of that letter the martyrdom of Peter, although he doesn't mention the details. And in the other first century source is actually John's gospel, because in John chapter 21, Jesus anticipates Peter's death ahead of time. And if John was written when most scholars think it was, between 1995 AD, then it seems very unlikely that John would have attributed that prophecy to Jesus had it not actually happened in the way that he described. So there's two first century sources, and then you've got second century sources as well, including Origen and Tertullian and so forth. And also the martyrdom of James, the Lord's brother. James, according to the New Testament, at least it suggested he was not a believer during Jesus' lifetime. In fact, he was a skeptic. John chapter 7 verse 5 says not even Jesus' own brothers would believe in him. In John 19, when Jesus is on the cross, he entrusts the care of his mother Mary, not to his own brother James, but to the beloved disciple. And of course, that makes sense if his brother was not a believer in him at that time. And yet, very shortly after the resurrection, in Acts chapter 1, Jesus' brothers are portrayed as praying alongside the disciples and Jesus' mother following the resurrection. And 1 Corinthians 15 provides, I think, a good explanation for that, namely that Jesus appeared to James following the resurrection. And I like to ask the skeptic, how much would it take to convince you that your elder brother was the Yahweh of the Old Testament to the point of martyrdom, right? Imagine doing Bible studies with your elder brother, and your brother's like, and you're studying, how God poured out the 10 plagues on the Egyptians, led the Israelites to the Red Sea, appeared to Moses at Mount Sinai, and your brother's like, yep, that was me. I did all these things. So it was during credulity. And so I think the fact that James was willing to die as a martyr, having been a skeptic during Jesus' lifetime, I think is best explained by the resurrection. And of course, this also relates to the question of how do we know that the apostles actually claimed this? This is not a legendary development. And I think we have multiple lines of evidence, just to list a couple very briefly. One is in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul quotes from what's largely thought to be an early creedal tradition, which most scholars think that he received from his upon his visit to Jerusalem in Galatians chapter, that he mentions in Galatians chapter 1, 3 years after his conversion, where he meets with Peter and James, the very people mentioned in that creedal tradition, where he says, what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and that he was buried, that he was raised again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then to more than 500 brothers at one time, was of whom was still living, with some have fallen asleep, and he appeared to James and to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one untimely born. And then he goes on to say, for I'm the least of the apostles, not even worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God, but the grace of God I am what I am, his grace towards me was not in vain. For in the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, but it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached and so we believed. And so, irrespective of whether or not that is in fact a creedal tradition that Paul picked up upon his visit to Jerusalem, which I don't think the evidence is conclusive on, but even apart from that discussion, Paul indicates that this message that he's now proclaiming concerning the resurrection has already been proclaimed to them by the apostles, the Jerusalem leadership, in particular Peter and James and the 12. And we have independent confirmation that from 1 Corinthians 1 that Peter actually had preached in Corinth, because Paul chides the Corinthians for having divisions and factions among them. Some say I follow Cephas, others Paul, others Apollos, others I follow Christ, and so forth. And then the book of Acts, of course, Acts chapter 2 mentions Peter boldly proclaiming at Pentecost the resurrection. And we know from Luke's own testimony and also from evidence from Paul that Luke was a traveling companion of the apostle Paul, and he was present with Paul in Jerusalem in Acts 21 when Paul met with the leaders of the Jerusalem church, including James, and was in prison with Luke was in prison with Paul for 2 years in Caesarea, close to Jerusalem, and so would have had access to the apostles and that treasure trove of living witnesses to the resurrection. And so we can trust him then, because Luke is a very faithful and reliable historian, and we can trust him, I think, to know what he's talking about when he says that at Pentecost, Peter was proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus.
Right. And I think this is an area that I work in a lot, as far as that they didn't really claim this. This was later. This was legendary. And this is where I would talk about our general evidence for the reliability of the Gospels themselves, and their scrupulousness and all these other indications that we have, that they were reporting what really happened. They weren't making stuff up or adding things for apologetic purposes. There's just a mountain of evidence to that effect that they didn't do that. The other thing I would emphasize, you were talking about the martyrdoms, and sometimes we don't know how people were actually martyred. This was one reason why when Tim and I wrote the 2009 paper for the Black Belt Companion, what we emphasized was that they risked death. And there were a number of people who misread that and said, you guys said that they died, and we don't, we had 13. We were doing our Bayes factor times 13. We don't have 13 different separate martyrdom accounts or whatever that are well verified. We said we didn't say that. We said that they risked death, and so we placed even more emphasis there upon the very obvious risk that they were taking very early in Jerusalem, where there's the martyrdom of Stephen. Stephen was a warning to them. It was a shot across the bow, or the Sanhedrin calling in Peter and John and saying, don't preach in this man's name anymore, and they have them flogged. Well, of course, this is the same Sanhedrin that just 50 days before had convinced Pilate to crucify Jesus. And that's going to be vivid in all their minds, especially John's, because he, I believe, was standing right there at the cross, followed Jesus on the road to the cross. That, these guys were pretty successful at getting Pilate to kill somebody. So then, of course, you have the persecution by Paul himself, or Saul, as he was then known. So that they were constantly facing death right there in those, in Acts 1 through 12. And of course, James, the son of Zebedee, is actually martyred in Acts 12. And, I said to Tim one time, I wonder why he didn't get John at the same time. He said, I don't know, maybe went out for a latte, that it was there was a certain amount of chance involved, presumably, as to which leader actually got martyred there in Acts 12. So that's something we can emphasize even for the ones for whom we do not have specific evidence that they died. It's not as though we have James, the son of Alphaeus, we have something written by him as to what he said, but we do see Peter counting them up. He counts up to 11 in Acts 1, and then he says, okay, now we need another one. We need Matthias. They elect Matthias and so forth. That number 12 is very important to them. So they were all out there, and it keeps referring to them as a body, the group, the apostles were teaching and preaching and testifying these things, and were sort of putting themselves out there with a target on their back. So I think that's real important.
One more thing too on the legend, if I may. You can say legend and people can nod their head and say, oh yeah, there's legends. But you have to account for how a legend develops. And skeptics have done that. They've tried to do that. Rather, they talk about it. Bart Ehrman, in, I don't know, 4 or 5 at least of his books, talks about the telephone game. And he says, the stories got spread around various language groups, people groups, religious groups, whatever kinds of groups around the Mediterranean, 40 different countries or something, or multiple countries at any rate. People talk about how it started out of a community of faith that was just devastated at the death of Christ, and that they had to invent something to salvage their, to resolve their cognitive dissonance, essentially. The kinds of processes that skeptics propose by which the legend developed are what I call story scrambling processes. And they produce, skeptics wonder how many angels there were at the tomb. And they say that we've got a real problem because the Gospels, apparently have a discrepancy there, which, by the way, is resolvable. But the kinds of discrepancies that should be there And the character of Jesus, especially, who comes across as exactly the same person in all the Gospels. And if you wonder about John, I'm sure Lydia will write a book to help you with that. She's working on it. The character of Jesus is incredibly consistent. He's not scrambled. There's not even any scrambling in terms of, like, who was the number 2 guy? What was Peter like? The stories are in all 4 accounts, and all the way through, and in every report afterwards, are not scrambled. So if the skeptic's legend theory is the only legend theory available, it fails. It just doesn't explain. It should have produced a scrambled outcome, and it didn't.
Can I just follow up on that one briefly, Tom?
Yeah.
I think that something that impresses me is the extent to which the message that the earliest Christians were rendering was something that flew in the face of both Roman and Jewish expectations and Roman and Jewish prejudices, to be blunt. This is something that William Paley covers beautifully in the opening chapters of his view of the evidences of Christianity. Paley says, look, the Jewish religion was all about technique. There was a proper way that God was worshipped. There was a proper place that God was worshipped. And here come the Christians saying, the franchise has been opened. Gentiles don't have to do all of these things that you're proud of, all of these things that you say are central. The Romans were fine with your gods as long as you were fine with theirs. And along come the Christians and say, we're absolute monotheists, and we do not acknowledge any of your deities, and all of your local deities to whom you pay local honors, forget it. And the worship of the emperor as deified, the previous Roman emperor as a god, nope. So they really came along and stuck a finger in the eye of so many different groups. And they had to know that in doing that, especially starting in Jerusalem, the very place where the religious and the political authorities had conspired to procure the crucifixion of the founder of their movement, this was not going to be a popular move. And that from the very beginning is not only a story, but the only story. That's the only account. There is no other account of the rise of Christianity. That's it. Not even in the mouth of someone like Celsus in his True Word from the 2nd century do we see an attempt to say, oh, you guys just totally fabricated this whole scenario. No, instead he mocks Jesus for being a carpenter. He mocks the Christians for worshiping somebody who got himself crucified. But the historical context of the story is really terribly important. Who does this? Muhammad, when he tried to get people to accept his new religion, first played a very conciliatory game with the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews. And after 10 years of making only about 100 converts total, since that wasn't working, he turned to military conquest. But the Christians, without any swords, at least in their hands, managed to explode across the Mediterranean in the teeth of the opposition. That's a really important factor. And I think that's something that is not as commonly recognized and stressed as it ought to be.
And following up on that, Tim, I think, and this will appeal to you being a Bayesian, when we look at the Old Testament, in various passages in Isaiah 49, Isaiah 42, Daniel 7, Zechariah 9, etc., one of the jobs that is prescribed to or assigned to the Messiah is that he would bring representatives of all nations to a recognition of the God of Israel. And he used to be a light to the Gentiles, right? That God's salvation might reach to the ends of the earth, as Isaiah 49 says, right? So on the hypothesis that Jesus is not who he claimed to be, on the hypothesis that he's not the Jewish Messiah, what are the odds that Jesus would bring representatives of all nations to a recognition of the God of Israel? Well, it seems that it's vanishingly small, because until 313 AD, the Christian church was the persecuted minority until Christianity became legal at the Edict of Milan in 313 under Constantine. And so it seemed the odds of it becoming such a dominant global religion seemed vanishingly small. On the other hand, what's the probability on the hypothesis that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is who he claimed to be, that Christianity would become the dominant world religion that it became? Well, it's approximately equal to 1, because it's actually said specifically in multiple places in the Hebrew Bible. And so that seems to be quite strong, Bayesian grounds for taking that to be a considerable piece of evidence for the messianic credentials of Jesus. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a point on that. Augustine's got a beautiful line. He says, the Jews are our librarians. They've preserved these prophecies. They've been in their hands. They're not of the Christians' making. They've been in the possession of the Jewish people for century upon century, wherever you date Isaiah, they had these things for centuries prior to the Christian era. So this is not some kind of special pleading on the part of Christians. These are things that were written in advance, and we can now look at them and say, okay, are we forcing it, or are there really clues here that we ought to be picking up on? And it's always something one worries about, right? You hear the prophecies of Nostradamus. How many of us have seen those on the front of the National Enquirer or some such rag saying, okay, right, we're not very persuaded by them. But these are very interesting because Jesus' life and ministry, unexpected as in many ways it was, that is what unlocks these things. It's like a key in the lock. And without that key, take Isaiah 52 through 53, for example, the suffering servant, and search down through the annals of history and try to find one other life that unlocks that passage like the life of Christ. In fact, if you read that aloud, or you hand it to somebody to read who is not a Christian, you say, who's this describing? Odds are very good that they'll say, oh, well, obviously that's Jesus. That must be something out of your, Gospels or something. No, this was written hundreds upon hundreds of years before anyone had ever heard of Jesus of Nazareth. It is really a remarkable correspondence.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have some questions that have been submitted. So let's dive into those. This one's from Tim B. He says, what are your thoughts on Richard Swinburne's methodology as it relates to the prior probability of the resurrection? Are there any reasons that God would become incarnate and raise someone like Jesus from the dead that he neglects that you think could bolster his case?
I want to address that, and I want to use the opportunity also to just pick up on what Jonathan said this last time too. It's very useful to remember in Bayesian terms that the probability of something does not have to be high in absolute terms on H, the hypothesis that one is saying is confirmed, in order for it to be orders of magnitude higher than it is on not H. So to take the example that Jonathan gave a minute ago, one might, and I might even be inclined to go at it a little differently, to say, it's too strong to say that the probability is 1, because after all, the Old Testament prophecy might be referring to something eschatological, that all the nations will come to worship him. And so it might not even be something that's been fulfilled yet or whatever. And Christianity does continue to be persecuted in many parts around the globe, blah, blah, blah. However, what we need is that it is more probable, what we see is more probable given Christianity, and even much more probable than given its negation. And as far as that's concerned, we have the Great Commission. We have Jesus saying, go into all the world, preach the gospel. We have Jesus foretelling in various parables the bringing in of the Gentiles into the fold. We have early in Acts, God sending Peter to Cornelius and so forth. And so we've got various ways in which Christianity reaches out beyond the Jewish people to the nations, the Gentiles, and so forth. And so what might seem a priori improbable if you just look at statements, he's a light to lighten the Gentiles and to glory to thy people Israel, or, all the Gentiles shall serve him, and that kind of thing. When did the Gentiles ever serve the Jews? All right, you look through hundreds and hundreds of years of history, and the Jews often seem to be getting trampled on and conquered and so forth. The sort of the Poland of the Middle East. But so that might seem improbable. Okay, that you would have a Jewish person, a Jewish leader who would be acknowledged and worshipped by the Gentiles. But it's a great deal less improbable based upon Christianity. And since we do in fact now find people from many, many, many different nations who are not Jewish at all worshiping Jesus, it's actually quite plausible to see that as a fulfillment now, kind of a realized eschatology of that prophecy without waiting for a final eschatology. So it just has to be higher, and all the better if it's higher by orders of magnitude, because it's a ratio. Okay, when we compare the probability of the evidence given H to the probability of the evidence given not H, it's a ratio. They do not have to sum to 1. Now, this leads into the question of
Lydia,
Swinburne.
can I jump in here for a second?
Go.
I'm a little concerned that there's probably a lot of people here who don't know the language you're speaking in terms of Bayes.
Right.
This might be unfamiliar.
Right.
Can we do just a one? I'd try it, but there's at least 2 experts on the call here.
I know I'm moving fast.
A 2-paragraph explanation of Bayesian thinking here.
Yeah, because Jonathan did it first. He did it first.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Jonathan's fault. No. So when we're talking about a measure for the strength of evidence, something that Tim and I and Jonathan all recommend as this measure is that you have a piece of evidence, like in the case that we were just talking about, the fact that people of all different nations worship Jesus, for example. So that's that's like a data point, okay? Or the fact that the women said that they found the tomb empty. That could be your data point. All right, so you have your data point. And then you say, what's the probability of that data point if a hypothesis like Jesus rose from the dead or Christianity is true? And what's the probability of that datum if that hypothesis is false? And then we stack those in a ratio. I don't mean to give anybody PTSD from their math classes, but a ratio is just, we just have that division sign. Okay, it's a fraction. All right, and I think the best way to do this, you don't necessarily have to, but I think the best way to do this is just to take the simple ratio of the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis over the probability of the evidence given that the hypothesis is false. And so when that's very top heavy, then the evidence is much, much more probable given that hypothesis than given that it's false. And part of what I was pointing out here is that those don't have to sum to 1, in order for that to be very top heavy. So for example, 0.01 over 0.0001 is a very top heavy ratio, even though 0.01 is small. Okay, so the top of that, we don't have to say, oh yeah, we would really expect this if the resurrection happened. Like for example, would we really expect Jesus to appear to James, his brother? I wouldn't. Man, if my brother was a jerk like that, I probably would not appear to him. After I rose from the dead, I'd say, let him go to hell. That's the kind of person I am. I'm not Jesus. But Jesus had other brothers that we don't have any record of his appearing to. Okay, so we don't have to say that the probability of James converting, given the resurrection, is like high. It's like close to 1, in order to say that the probability that James would convert, given that Jesus rose, is much higher than given that he did not rise. So it doesn't have to be high in some absolute sense. Now, that does relate to the Swinburne question, because I do find that sometimes Swinburne will try to argue, I think he burdens himself unnecessarily. He'll try to argue that it's likely that God would do something. Like if God existed, we should expect that he would send Jesus to, redeem us, or he would do this or do that. Now, I don't mean to misrepresent Swinburne, but I just think he sometimes feels he has to push too hard for a more of an absolutely high top to that. Whereas he doesn't necessarily have to. All he has to show is that it's much higher given that, say, God exists or the resurrection occurred than given that it didn't occur. So I think that would be a slight difference between my approach and Swinburne's. I think Tim has a comment he wants to make here.
Yeah, let me just do 2 things. First of all, it might help if I give a non-theological example of what's going on with all this math that's fluttering around. So I'm going to do this without equations, but I hope that this example will make the structure of what we're talking about clear to you. Suppose I'm going for a walk in the woods, and I'm pretty far away from all the major inhabited areas, and deep in the woods, not on a path, but just sort of off on my own, I come across a cabin. It's a little run down, but it's not collapsed. And I think, wow, that's really weird. I wonder how long this has been standing there. And initially, I figure it must be abandoned. There's no way to get a car in here. There's nothing like a driveway. I can't imagine someone's living this far out in the woods. So my, as we would say, prior probability, my sort of anticipation that it's occupied is very, very low. I walk up to the door and I give it a little bit of a push, and to my surprise, it swings open. And so I peer inside, and there is a sparsely furnished but clean room. And on a table right in the middle of the room, there is a cup of tea. It's Earl Grey tea. The tea bag is still in it, and it's hot. It's steeping right at this moment. Now, if you had asked me before I pushed the door open, what's the probability that the inhabitant of this, if it were inhabited, would like Earl Grey tea and would in fact have a cup of tea steeping right there, right now, I would say, I don't know. I don't suppose it's very high. You know what? Maybe this person doesn't like tea. Maybe he's a coffee drinker. Maybe he's gone for the week. I have no idea how to give any very high probability to that. But the moment that I see that there's a fresh cup of tea steeping there, I know the cabin is inhabited. Because be that probability great or small, it's vastly greater than the probability that there will be a fresh cup of tea steeping on the table if it's uninhabited. That's the way that the evidence works here. We're looking at evidence which we might not have been able to pump up in advance and say, oh, I positively expect this. But once we see it, we see the mismatch between our expectation if there's someone living there and our expectation if there's not. And for many of the pieces of evidence that we would adduce for the resurrection, that's the direction we would go. Second comment, and this looping back to Tim's question about Swinburne's methodology, I really like something that William Paley does in the preparatory considerations for his view of the evidences of Christianity. And so this is how I would go about it. It's not quite the way that Swinburne would go about it. So maybe this will just give you an extra string to your bow or something. Swinburne doesn't, as far as I recall, stress the fact that if there is a God who wants to give us some kind of important message and certify it in a way we can't dismiss as due to mere human ingenuity, oh, this is a great philosopher, a clever poet or something, but something that we really can't write off as merely of human invention, then a miracle is more or less inevitable. There's really no other way to seal the deal like that. And so be that probability great or small, it's not any smaller than the probability that there is a God and that he wishes to certify some important message to us. So that would be, and that is actually Paley's way of setting a lower bound, and that's a move he makes in addressing David Hume's skeptical argument concerning miracles. He very much has Hume in mind. He names him explicitly there. So whether you need to do everything else and all the other moves that Paley makes in that discussion, I won't go into here, but that, I think, is an interesting way to think about it that gives us a different way of going about setting a lower bound on that probability, that prior probability.
Okay, any other comments on that? I'd also say that the fact that not only do we have independent reason to think that God exists, but we also the cross and resurrection of Christ turns out to be the culmination and climax of the Hebrew Bible itself, I think raises the prior probability, because it's not simply any old miscellaneous bloke that's being raised from the dead, but rather Jesus of Nazareth fits into a, to borrow terminology from William Lane Craig, a theohistorical context, right? And I think that significantly raises the prior probability relative to what it otherwise would be. Okay. An anonymous attendee asks, if we assume that Jesus was mistaken on the delay of the parousia, how do you think that would affect the probability that Jesus rose from the dead?
Let me take it a little all the way. If we assume the Bible was wrong, then Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Let's just lay that one out. we're close to that territory when we get there. This assumption thing needs to be tested in itself. In other words, I don't think that there are so many different ways in which the Bible has demonstrated its reliability. The fact that there is a way to interpret Jesus as being wrong is more or less, I think, overwhelmed by the fact that there are ways to interpret Jesus as still being correct in context of the fact that he's been right on so many other things. So I wouldn't jump to that assumption. Yeah, you can interpret him as being wrong, but the kingdom of God among you, could that refer to his resurrection? Well, in Jewish understanding, the resurrection meant the kingdom of God had arrived. They didn't think of it as an individual's resurrection. They thought of it in terms of the resurrection of the saints in Jewish terms. But Jesus' resurrection symbolized the kingdom, or would have even been interpreted as a kingdom, possibly. I don't think we have to jump to that assumption that he was wrong.
Yeah, there are going to be people, of course, who are going to try to take some kind of a emptying of himself, that Jesus could have been the Son of God, but fallible and could have actually made mistakes. I don't think they can try in that sense to insulate themselves against disconfirmation by saying, well, no, he rose from the dead, but he also made mistakes. I would not go that direction. I would say, sure, if I thought Jesus was wrong, that would tend to disconfirm. But as Tom says, why should I assume that? For example, the exact order in which he said things in that Olivet discourse, which is probably the strongest evidence for a mistake on Jesus' prediction, is we don't necessarily have to take that to have been given in that order. In fact, what we could have would be a memory where they remembered that he said these various things, and because the destruction of Jerusalem had not yet happened, the person reporting initially, which whether you think Matthew wrote first or Mark wrote first, could be grouping things by topic, not necessarily remembering the exact order, knowing that he said them on that occasion. And I do think it's somewhat important that it looks like he did say them on that occasion, but not remembering verbatim the exact order. And in fact, in that sense, it's evidence of the earliness of the report, and that it was probably written prior to the fall of Jerusalem. Because if it had been written after the fall of Jerusalem, Matthew would have caught himself and would have said, oh, wait a minute, Jesus didn't come back. Some of these things happened. There was the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, and so forth. And he didn't return with his angels and send his angels out to gather the souls and all that kind of thing. So I better not, report it that way, because it's going to look like Jesus was disconfirmed. But he didn't do that. And you could say, well, that means that Matthew or Mark interpreted Jesus as talking about the same events in there. That's a guess. Maybe they did. Maybe that's why they grouped those things that he said in that discourse all together like that, so that he immediately says, this generation shall not pass away before all these things are fulfilled. You can do a fairly easy reordering, and I don't have the verse numbers right here in my head. You can do a fairly easy reordering where if you just pick up, one chunk and you just drop it down, if he said, this generation shall not pass before all these things are fulfilled, in a slightly different place after the business about various things that could apply just to the destruction of Jerusalem, then he would be right. Okay, and in an unequivocal way, and then he would have been separately talking about the parousia, and the disciples just didn't pick up on that. They just didn't know that. Presumably after the destruction of Jerusalem, they began to pick up on it and said, oh, he was talking about two different things there, and so forth. but they just didn't realize that perhaps at first. So I don't really see that as a problem. And it requires a little bit of reordering of the discourse, but that's not necessarily a problem either, because I don't think that they were trying to make it look like he said it in this exact order. This is why we don't say that things are absolutely like a tape recorder verbatim. In fact, if you were reporting somebody's speech, you might report it somewhat more topically as far as the order in which he reported it, because that's the best you were able to remember it. So I think that's a perfectly legitimate way to say that Jesus didn't actually make a mistake there. There's another place where he says something about the seeing the glory of God or something like that, and it could apply to the transfiguration. So that's a different passage that could be fulfilled by the transfiguration as well. So those are the ways that I would go with both of those.
Also in Matthew 24, if we take it as at least a presumption that Matthew is intending to speak persuasively, the whole chapter of the Olivet Discourse has the feel of something that's looking into the distant future, especially verse 14, where he says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." They can't have, at any point when Matthew would have been alive to have written this, they can't have thought that that was really that close to happening. They didn't have that small a picture of the world. So it seems to me that Matthew, when he wrote this, would have had in mind the fact that the idea that this is a long-term thing that's going to take a while. That's the flavor of the whole passage. And so it seems to me that Matthew would have had in mind the idea that Jesus had something longer term in mind when he spoke that one sentence as well.
And notice also that part of this text is often taken out of context, especially by movies like Left Behind and so forth, where it says in Matthew 24, verse 4 and following, Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For men will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will lead many astray. But you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, so that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains." And this is often interpreted as being the signs of the end, or the earthquakes and the famines and the pestilences and the war, nation rising up against nation and kingdom against kingdom and so forth. But actually, Jesus, I think, is saying the very opposite of that. These are not the signs of the end, right? These are things that you can expect to happen, but don't be alarmed by these things, because the end is not yet. The end is still future. And as you said, rightly, you get a feel for Matthew 24 and the other parallel accounts of this Olivet Discourse that Jesus is prepping the disciples for a long wait. In fact, he says he goes on to say that immediately after the tribulation of those days,
25. I gotta put my glasses on here. 29.
Yeah, so so when he says that this generation will not pass away until these things have been fulfilled, he's talking about I think he's talking about the generation that observes the signs that he's talking about will not pass away until all these things have been fulfilled. At least that would be the interpretation I would lean towards.
That's at least plausible. And if there is a plausible way to make it comport with the entire rest of the discourse, why break it out and make it something else?
Well, and what's interesting here is that we're actually giving two different possibilities, but it's useful to remember that it's the disjunction that we have to consider as far as Jesus being wrong. So in a way, there's a strength here that I'm suggesting that when he says this generation shall not pass away, he means it quite literally, and is referring, and that he actually said it originally with reference to the destruction of Jerusalem in a slightly different order. And that's what I would lean toward. Jonathan would lean toward this generation shall not pass away, meaning this generation that sees the signs. That's a different one. But if either of us is right, Jesus wasn't wrong. So it's this or this or this, and I think that disjunction is kind of important. So I think what we would all say is, sure, if we believed that Jesus was wrong, that would have a negative evidential force for his rising from the dead. But we don't think that we have to accept that Jesus made a mistake there.
Can I just follow up on something Tom mentioned and others about the overall context of Jesus' teaching? If you look at a passage like Matthew 13, where we have the parable of the wheat and the tares, the enemy comes and he sows this seed that will look at first rather like the wheat as it's growing up and only in the end be differentiated. There's a long view that's there, that there's this idea that the long-term growth of the kingdom is going to be something that's going to take time, and only in the end, which is down there a ways, will we see how this is all panned out. It's got another one, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that falls into the ground and it grows up into a tree and its branches spread and the fowls of the air can come. I think that's Mark 4. So there are various ways in which Jesus' teaching suggests a longer view as well. And the early Christians saw no tension between his Olivet discourse and these parables. And I think that it would be unreasonable of us to forget that these also are data points regarding how Jesus was understood even by his immediate followers. And this is a point that I think needs to be brought up in the way of giving a context to some of these discussions, because sometimes we get the impression that people want to say, Jesus predicted the end of the world, it didn't come, the end. And not only is that questionable for all the reasons that Lydia and Jonathan have brought up, but also the other context, the wider context, gives us a reason to look for an interpretation that is consistent with what we glean from these parables.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. We've got a lot of questions submitted and probably not get through all of them, but we can try and do some. So here's a question. This is from Rob. Why do people like David Klinghoffer not believe? What is the strongest evidence against the resurrection? David Klinghoffer is actually a friend of mine. He's the editor of all of my articles at Evolution News and Science Today at the Discovery Institute. And I have read his book, Why the Jews Rejected Jesus, and which gives a number of standard objections to Jesus' messianic credentials from an Orthodox Jewish perspective. Typically, Orthodox Jews, including David Klinghoffer, argue along the line of Jesus didn't fulfill what was prescribed of the messianic job, namely to establish worldwide peace and establish a global dominion and so forth. And we as believers would say that there is two comings of Christ. And in fact, I think the Old Testament actually indicates, or at least hints at, there being two comings. For example, in Zechariah chapter 12, it says in verse 10, I will pour out in the house of David and the house of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me and him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn, which suggests that Yahweh, when he's coming again, had come on a previous occasion. And this, of course, there's intertextuality here with Zechariah 14, where it speaks about Yahweh coming to deliver his people when all nations are encamped against Jerusalem. And it says in verse 4, in that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley. And so here we see that Yahweh actually has physical feet when he's coming to the Mount of Olives. And this makes perfect sense in view of the incarnation. And of course, this is actually alluded to in Acts chapter 1 when Jesus ascends from the Mount of Olives, and the disciples are told by the angel, this Jesus whom you saw go up into heaven will return the same way you saw him go. In other words, his feet will once again stand upon the Mount of Olives. For those of you who happen to be Unitarians, there's the deity of Christ in the first chapter of the book of Acts, because it's alluding, I think, to this text in Zechariah 14. But in verse 9, it says that Yahweh will be king over all the earth, and that day Yahweh will be one and his name one. But in Zechariah 9, the one who was king over all the earth is the Messiah. in Zechariah 9 through 11, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on the colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow should be cut off, and he shall speak peace to the nations. His rule should be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to your stronghold, the prisoners of hope. Today I declare that I will restore to you double. You can see very, very clear intertextual parallels with the Messianic servant songs in the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah 9, 11, 42, 49, and 53. It speaks about the blood of the covenant, and of course, the Messiah is to be the messenger of a new covenant. It speaks about setting prisoners free from the waterless pit, which parallels language in Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 9. It speaks about him establishing worldwide dominion and peace, as Isaiah says that they will beat their swords into plowshares and so forth. And so it seems to indicate that this individual spoken of in Zechariah 9 is in fact the Messiah that's referred to in Isaiah multiple times. And yet this Messianic king also seems to be the same figure as that in Zechariah 14, who is described as Yahweh and the one whose feet will stand in the Mount of Olives. And Zechariah 12 indicates that they will look on me, on him whom they have pierced. Well, who have they pierced? They pierced the divine Messiah. And so the fact that Zechariah 12 says when Yahweh comes, they will look on him whom they have pierced seems to suggest that that the Messiah had actually come multiple times. And by the way, in case you weren't convinced of the deity of Christ in Zechariah 9 from that parallel I made with chapter 14, this is even more explicit if you look at Zephaniah 3, where it actually, from verse 14, very striking parallels with Zechariah 9, Zephaniah 3:14 and following, sing aloud, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. And so you can see very striking parallels about shout, sing aloud, daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. And then who's the king here? And the king of Israel, Yahweh, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall never again fear evil. You also see a parallel with Zechariah 9 when you get to verse 20. It says, at that time I'll bring you in, at that time when I gather you together, for I will make you renowned and praised among all the people of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says the Lord. Zechariah 9 also spoke about restoring the fortunes of Israel, restoring to them double. And so you see all these connections, and yet the king here is actually Yahweh. So putting the pieces together, then we see that the Yahweh, when he ascends upon the Mount of Olives, he has physical feet, which is consistent with him being the Messiah. And also we've got the intertextual parallel of Zechariah 9 suggesting that Yahweh is the Messiah who's coming. Zechariah 12 indicates that when Yahweh, the Messiah, comes, he will people will look upon him, on him whom they have pierced, which very strongly suggests that actually the Messiah is to come twice. Another final point I'll make on this is that often Orthodox Jews will say that it is special pleading to say that to propose that there are two comings of the Messiah. But actually, if you look at what the prophecies concerning the return from exile in Jeremiah, for example, or in other places, including Isaiah, Ezekiel, it says that there are various things that are to accompany the return from exile. For example, the temple is going to be rebuilt, and there's going to be this nationwide regathering to God and so forth. And a lot of the prophecies concerning, and also the Messiah is to be revealed, and a lot of these things are fulfilled at the return from exile from Babylon, but many of them are also not fulfilled. And what Orthodox Jews say then is that yes, some of these were fulfilled, but there's also an eschatological fulfillment. And so if Orthodox Jews are allowed to do that in respect to those prophecies concerning the return from exile, then why are we not allowed to do it, especially when there's biblical basis for it in the Old Testament itself and the Jewish scriptures? Why are we not allowed to suggest that something similar is going on here, where you have a first coming and also an eschatological coming of Christ?
I wanted to address something that I think may lie behind the question. The question asked why someone like David Klinghoffer doesn't believe, and then what's the strongest evidence against the resurrection? And so Jonathan answered that in terms of Christian to Jewish evangelism and Messianic prophecy. But I think something that might also lie behind is this assumption that if somebody really intelligent like David Klinghoffer doesn't believe in the resurrection, there must be some really strong evidence against it. And so, we should admit that we out here, we got to admit there's evidence against it. And I want to say something a little different than, oh, gee, I got to dredge up some kind of strong evidence against the resurrection. Something a little different I want to say is that I think there's an understandable human tendency to find it difficult to believe in a miracle that happened a really long time ago. And that doesn't mean that we can't be justified in it. That's more of a psychological comment than an epistemological comment. And yet psychologically, it is understandable. And I think that's why Jesus said to Thomas, blessed are they who have not seen it have yet believed. He didn't mean that Thomas was bad for wanting to see his wounds and so forth. But I think Jesus was thinking of people far in the future who would believe on the basis of the testimony of the apostles. In fact, he even mentions that in the high priestly prayer in John 17, those who will believe through their word. We've had 2,000 years that have passed with people believing through their word, and psychologically, it gets harder. And so I think there are people, including probably David Klinghoffer, who, and many, many more, who find it hard, not because evidence can't show it, not because Hume was right, not because there's strong evidence against it, but just because we are very, very concrete people, and we tend to want something to happen in a way that we can touch and see ourselves right here, right now, and have a sign, like they said at Jesus' own time, what sign do you give us in our own time and in our own day and in front of us? And so that's hard. So I think that's part of the reason why well-intentioned and intelligent people don't believe in the resurrection.
They don't believe in it because they, in essence, because they don't believe there's a God. They don't believe there's a God who would do that, and that's a prior to the evidence kind of an assessment, actually. That's the one I hear most often. There can't be a resurrection because there's no miracles. Well, there's no miracles because there's no God.
Well, of course, there are Muslims that don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus either, though.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
True.
So, I mean, there are people from other religious traditions.
Yeah, I'm talking about the ones I run into most often, and you're right to remind me that the ones that I run into most often aren't the only ones who have an interest in this. I tend to focus on what I encounter most often. But yeah, there is, either a God, there's no God, or a God wouldn't do this kind of a thing. I run into the God wouldn't do this thing fairly often. I've run into it recently, or several times this week, actually, where from naturalist atheists who say God wouldn't do this, and I'm rather puzzled as to where they got this much theological knowledge that tells them that there's no such thing as theological knowledge. It's kind of curious to me.
There's a question from Rob. Says, is there a simple way to proclaim the resurrection? I think Jonathan's presentation to Peter Atkins in their debate was too complicated and tends to lose the audience.
There are thousands of simple ways. There have to be. I mean, you can start with just saying it happened and seeing it. Go until you find something that either persuades a person or where they say, I'm done talking about this. I'm not listening any further. Thanks, but let's talk about something else. But how many different ways are there to approach it? The minimal facts method, the reliability of the scriptures method, the change that there's a resurrection presented or that resulted upon the resurrection in the lives of the early church, the early disciples, the archaeology. How many other? I'm just starting.
I like to take the one that Jonathan did at the beginning and just, for purposes of presentation, simplify it a little more by making it a trilemma, leaving out the proposition that they never attested this, and just saying, it's kind of a liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma only for the disciples. So I call it a trilemma for the disciples. Either they were lying, they were crazy, or it really happened. And I believe Paley does it as they were deceivers, they were deceived, or it occurred. And under deceived, he would include, just mistaken. So that's kind of simple. That's neat. It's a deductive version of it. And I like that way of doing it. Then if the other person says, oh, but I don't believe they ever attested this at all. I mean, this is kind of what Tom was saying. Go until you run into a block. the other person says, oh, those aren't the only options because I think that these are embellished. They never attested that at all. Then you're like, okay, we can go there, if that's what you're going to do. So that I like that. And I think it's compatible with what I call a maximal data approach. We were debating this like literally almost right up until I actually activated my camera and clicked on the Zoom link to come on here. Is the maximal data approach that I recommend. Too hard, too complicated, something that's not, easily portable, carried in your pocket. And I think if you do it in that way with a trilemma like that, it's very, very readily portable. And then you just find out where your particular audience is at as far as what's the sticking point for that trilemma.
I want to take a question from YouTube, so the YouTube viewers don't feel left out. This question is from Richard Howard. He says, "Does Herod's fear that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected show that Jews at the time did have a concept of a single person being resurrected before the general resurrection?" I would say to that you have to make a distinction between a resuscitation, as it were, and a resurrection to glory and immortality, because there are certainly cases of resurrections that are attested in Judaism. In the Old Testament, for example, Elijah is a young boy from the dead, for example. You see resurrections, resurrection of Lazarus, you see resurrection of the book of Acts, and so forth. So we have the resurrection of the people in Matthew 27, and so I think we have to make a distinction between a resuscitation where someone would go on to die again and a resurrection to glory and immortality. And the latter was not expected to occur prior to the general resurrection at the end of the world. So that's what I would clarify on that. Jesus' resurrection, on the other hand, is a resurrection to glory and immortality, where he has his glorified body. And so he's considered the first fruits from among the dead, the first fruits of those that have fallen asleep. Anything to add to that, anyone?
Got it.
Okay. And folks, feel free to let me know when you want to wrap up. So let's move on to another question. Tim B. Says, how do you think Jesus' predictions weigh in probabilistically to the resurrection? Do you think they weigh into our background knowledge going in, or do you think they provide evidence for the resurrection?
I think you can see them as providing a context where if God is going to raise someone from the dead, it's going to be somebody who's got something to say. And it's not all that implausible that it would be somebody who would tell you, look, I'm going to be vindicated in all of this. Just watch me. The idea of Jesus saying, hold my wine while he goes to do these things, it maybe is a little bit of a humorous way of putting it, but the point is, if Jesus had just been some completely anonymous peasant who never tried to teach anybody anything, but just minded his own business, scratched his little patch of dirt, and died, then it's hard to see what the point would have been in raising him from the dead specifically, not as a means to pointing to someone else's authority, but in his own right. Whereas someone who comes bearing a message and says, if you don't believe my witness, just hang on. You'll have even more reason than before. That's the sort of person you want to keep your eye on. That doesn't mean by itself that that person will be raised from the dead. But I think that we have to realize that this whole idea of a religious context cuts two ways. David Hume, the great Scottish skeptic, says that we should immediately dismiss a miracle that is embedded in a religious context and is brought forward as the proof of religion, because people have been so imposed upon in religious contexts that that should itself be full proof that this is just a cheat. He has half of a point. The half of the point that he has is that religions are places where people are particularly looking for miracles, and so it's easier to find the chumps there. If you want to fool somebody, that's a place to go. On the other hand, it's also the place where you would expect a real miracle to occur if there were a real miracle. So you can kind of see, in both cases, on both sides, yeah, both fake and true miracle claims are likely to arise in religious contexts, that doesn't really settle the issue for us. So I guess Jesus' claims sort of up the ante, right? If he's wrong, he's going to be spectacularly wrong. If he's right, he's going to be spectacularly right.
I would say too that if you say we're not sure about the testimony, this is part of the gospel, might not be true. Okay, maybe his claims don't increase the probability of the resurrection. I would say that the lack of claims would I'm echoing Tim in a way here. The lack of any claim would decrease the probability. It makes sense. It just fits, and because it fits, that actually does increase the probability, and it strengthens the case.
One thing I'd also say is, in reference to dialogues with Muslims, I often talk to Muslims, and there's at least one Muslim in our audience this evening, and I have often used what I call the crucifixion dilemma, which is to say that if Jesus predicts ahead of time his impending death and subsequent resurrection, then one of two things is true. Either Jesus does die of a crucifixion, in which case Islam's wrong, because Islam says the opposite in Surah 4, verse 157, or Jesus does not die of a crucifixion, in which case he's a false prophet, in which case Islam's also wrong, because Islam claims he's a true prophet. And so the crucial premise then is, did Jesus in fact claim that he would be raised from the dead? And can we support that historically as something that's actually grounded in reality, not something that the gospel author has fictionally attributed to Jesus? And this is where I'd appeal to various evidences pertaining to some of the statements of Jesus. Lydia documents an example of an undesigned coincidence in her book pertaining to Jesus' statement in John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, when after he cleanses the temple, the Jews confront him saying, what sign do you show us to prove your authority to do this? And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And it turns out he's speaking about his body and the resurrection from the dead. And it turns out that we can attest that from looking at the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Mark 14:58 and Matthew 26, verse 61, when Jesus is at his trial before Caiaphas, the high priest, and the false witnesses step forward saying, we heard this man say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and 3 days will build another, but not by human hands. And then also later in Mark 15:29 and Matthew 27, verse 40, Jesus is on the cross, and the passersby are mocking him and ridiculing him, saying, aha, you who destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, come down from the cross now and save yourself, and we will believe you. Nothing in either Matthew or Mark's account gives us a pretext for that allegation. In fact, it's a twisting of what Jesus actually said, because Jesus said nothing about destroying a man-made temple and rebuilding it in 3 days, but not by human hands. And so even on the basis of Matthew and Mark, we have what's called an unexplained illusion, where you have something which is just an irrelevant detail that's thrown into the text. And in this case, it's an allegation against Jesus where there's no background or context applied, and the reader is left scratching his head wondering, did Jesus actually say something like this? And yet it seems that it's not something that's come up with out of whole cloth, especially in view of Jesus' resurrection predictions, where he often uses the expression 3 days, after 3 days, or on the third day, or after 3 days and 3 nights, and so forth. And so it seems that it's more likely to be a garbled version of something Jesus said. And yet when you turn over to John chapter 2, 18 and 19, you have the pretext for that allegation, but not the later misrepresentations. So the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Mark, provide us with the later misrepresentations, but not the original statement. John's Gospel provides the original statement, but not the later accusations and misrepresentations of Jesus' words. So neither of those is copied from the other, and it's an undesigned coincidence that then attests to the independence of those accounts and supports the veracity of that statement. And you also have the criterion of embarrassment relating to, for example, in Mark 8, when Jesus predicts the resurrection, Peter takes him aside saying, this will never happen to you. And Jesus rebukes him, calling him Satan. Get behind me, Satan. You have in mind not the things of God, but the things of man. And so the criterion of embarrassment also seems to provide evidence for the veracity of that statement also. Okay. Let's take another question. So this is a question from Rob. What do you think of John Warwick Montgomery's arguments for the resurrection? I'm not familiar with the distinctions.
Not either.
Go, Tim.
I was a high school and college student at the time that I encountered Montgomery's work in his book, Where is History Going? And in particular, his 2 lectures, Jesus Christ in History, that he gave at the University of British Columbia. And that was my entry point into evidential apologetics, and a very good entry point indeed. I am grateful to this day for Montgomery's emphasis on historical work, on the reliability of the Gospels. Montgomery, as do many scholars, places a lot of emphasis on 1 Corinthians 15, and I acknowledge that it's an interesting passage and it has its value. I would probably lay more stress even than he does, and he does stress this, on the reliability of the Gospels themselves as first-hand attestations. But all of that being said, that came at a point in my life when people were recommending other things that were not nearly so convincing to me. And when I found Montgomery's work, that was the place where I realized I could put down my anchor. And so I'm a very, very big John Warwick Montgomery fan.
Excellent. Why don't we take John Loftus's questions? These are questions that were pre-submitted ahead of time. John Loftus, for those of you who don't know, is a former student of William Lane Craig who has apostatized and has edited and written many books against Christianity. He says, would you comment on this quote? The minimal facts approach is not a fair approach to the data, to say the least. By virtue of any disagreements, it's not fair for their side to take off the table any facts the other side objects to. That is special pleading, pure and simple, in favor of Christian scholarship. So what is offered are minimal facts, are not minimal facts, not all the facts. So what is offered are minimal facts, not all the facts. What is needed is a sound argument for why apologists can arbitrarily exclude certain things from the discussion. Only if both sides agree on this can apologists Habermas and Lacona go ahead and make their case. But skeptics, atheists, and agnostics don't. I personally think that he's not really understanding the minimal facts approach, which is to say that the minimal facts advocates such as Habermas and Lacona are saying that they're tying their hand behind their back by using only data which enjoys the consensus of scholarly support, and so it doesn't seem like they're special pleading, but rather trying to tie their hand behind their back here. So even though I don't utilize the minimal facts apologetic, I don't think this is a very fair objection.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say exactly that. If anything, what they're excluding is they're deliberately excluding things that might tell in favor of their argument. So it's I'm not a fan of minimal facts, but that's not the criticism I would make at all. And if someone thinks they're leaving something out that's contrary to Christianity or to the resurrection in a debate context, that's the perfect place to bring that up. And of course, Bart Ehrman and those guys do that. And Mike Lacona and Gary Habermas, they go out and they debate them and they answer what they try to bring up as counter evidence, but they're not doing minimal facts in order to leave out counter evidence. In a sense, they're doing minimal facts in order to base it on something that they think their opponent is going to grant. I think that's too limiting myself, but as Jonathan says, not for that reason.
I'll just add that in my article on miracles for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which you can read online for free, I specifically discuss the minimal facts approach and draw attention to the fact that one move one can make is to adduce other facts, also widely agreed upon, that would be better explained by the miracles not having taken place. Now, it's up to the scholar to try to find such facts if he can, but I actually go out of my way to say, well, this is a way that one could try to respond to this kind of an argument. So it's hardly like we're trying to hide something here. I'm a maximal data guy myself, but that's just not a fair criticism of the minimal facts approach.
I agree. Okay, he has another question that he submitted. He says, would you please make 3 distinctions, then answer the question that follows. 1, do you differentiate between objective evidence coming from artifacts, astronomy, geology, genetics, archaeology, philology, DNA, clinical trials, cell phones, and testimonial evidence coming from people who say they saw a miracle? Testimonial evidence is weak by comparison.
Whoa. Let's just stop right there with the first one. Hello? Where did we get that? This is like cargo cult epistemology. We're going to do this all really simply with just this one distinction. It's direct or it's indirect, and that's all there is to it. If you try to go that way, you'll get yourself tangled up even in non-religious contexts. An X-ray is a physical object. I assume that would count as some kind of direct evidence. The word of a doctor is testimonial. But if you hand me the X-ray, I may have no idea what to make of it in terms of whether I have a particular kind of problem or not. Whereas if my doctor, without showing me the physical X-ray, says, well, I've looked at your X-ray and here's what I see, I'm going to be rationally much more confident in his word than I am in something I glean from the object. Physical objects are not actually literally self-interpreting, and there are often layers of inference that go on. And so that this idea that testimony is some kind of second-class evidence is just really, truly silly. We get most of our knowledge, most of us get our knowledge even of what the facts are, of what the archaeological facts are, by testimony from people who claim to be, have seen them. So we already have a layer of testimony works in there. There are ways that testimonial evidence can be integrated with other testimonial evidence and with external clues that are very interesting and powerful. The texture of eyewitness testimony, not just the fact that somebody said X happened, but the way that he says it, the things he includes and leaves out, and the way those dovetail or fail to dovetail with other things. These are all tremendously interesting. And to treat this as though it's just a direct or indirect thing and flatten it all out like that and then plant one's flag and sail away is more than merely naive. This is a kind of special pleading in its own right.
It's scientism in action, or it smacks of that. It may not be, but it certainly has that flavor that we have to have it scientifically, or else we don't have it. And that's just, that's going the wrong direction.
And ironically, all scientific papers are testimony, right?
Yes.
Someone's giving testimony. Yeah. This is the results that they received, right? This is their data.
Yeah.
You haven't repeated all of the experiments from the paper. So he says, testimonial evidence over time is weaker by comparison. Hearsay testimonial evidence over time is very weak by comparison. Hearsay testimonial evidence coming from the pre-scientific world of superstitious people is extremely weak evidence. Excuse me.
I'm going to cut in again. Just how ignorant was a first century Jew?
These were the people, Tim, these were the people who didn't know that virgins didn't have kids. These are the people who didn't know that you don't rise from the grave.
Yeah, I mean, these people lived closer to birth and death than most of us. They saw executions. A shepherd who's birthing lambs out in the field knows something about where big lambs come from. They come from little lambs, which come from their mommies, which come from sex. This was not an ignorant population. It's as though they would have needed to understand quantum chromodynamics in order to be able to give fair testimony to whether someone was living or dead.
If they'd been that ignorant, they wouldn't have known it was a miracle.
That's just bizarre. Why would you?
So what's happening here
John
is
Loftus.
He's got like three things, and he's like, "Will you acknowledge these 3 things?" And then, answer the question that follows. And what I think we're seeing is we're going to go, no. No, we're not.
So far.
No, not that one. No, not that one either. And nope, not that one. By the time we get to the question, it'll be interesting to see what happens. All right, go.
And what's funny as well is that Theophilus of Antioch, who was a 2nd century church father, he has a dialogue, he writes an apology to Autolycus, who was a pagan, and he says, "Now, as to your saying that the dead are not raised, for you say, show us even one who's been raised from the dead, that seeing we may believe." Right? And Justin Martyr also in his First Apology has a section where he defends the possibility of resurrection to people who are skeptical of the possibility of resurrection. So I think that Mr. Loftus is very misguided here. So he goes on. He says, objective evidence doesn't lie. People do. People misunderstand and mischaracterize. Most people believe first and ask questions later. Thinking like a scientist is a learned skill.
Okay, I mean, where to begin? Where to begin with this? It's like saying the evidence you have is testimony, and some testimony is worthless. Therefore, the evidence you have is worthless. I might as well say the evidence for atheism is in some books, and some books are worthless. So the evidence for atheism is worthless. That would be just as good of an argument, and of course, it's terrible. And Loftus should disagree and object vociferously to it. But that's the same reason that I'm objecting to his argument. That's just that's a silly way to go about trying to assess the weight of evidence, as though you could just put your hand over your eyes and say, wait, it's called testimony, therefore I know it's weak. That just doesn't work. That's not how any of this works.
Let me also point out here, and I don't want to sound like I'm, belong to the Innocence Project or something, but the idea that physical evidence and self-interpreting has sent innocent people to jail. So now I did not get a chance to look up this story before coming on here. I did know about this question and I had intended to. Somebody can maybe look it up, but I read something a year or two ago about hair evidence in criminal trials, and that and I guess this was before DNA evidence was involved, but actually looking at different types of hair that were found on the scene of a crime and concluding that the accused had committed the crime. It gave, so the article claimed, a false impression of objectivity to the conviction that this had to be this guy's hair, that was found on the scene of the crime. This is how I remember the story at any rate. And so then the person would be convicted. And then it was later discovered that this was very difficult to interpret as to whether it was definitely this person's hair, rather than someone else's hair. It might have been the other way around. He had the victim's hair, in his car or something like that. But that, without something more fine-grained, as it were, saying that this hair definitely belongs to this person is much harder than the expert witnesses gave the impression of. And so then people were convicted on this basis and later had their convictions questioned or possibly overturned. But that kind of arises from that kind of naive scientism that says, as he said right there, physical evidence doesn't lie. So then what we do is we overleap it to say, therefore, my interpretation of the physical evidence is something that you must accept. That's kind of the road to prosecutorial hell. So I just wanted to point that out.
It's very idealistic, and it's also very extremely epistemologically limiting, because the kind of objective evidence that he will allow as evidence could only lead to a naturalistic conclusion, because he's only looking for evidence that can apply to the natural sciences, and that's just question begging all to pieces. That's.
Let me just add something to that, Tom, and this is very much in line with what you're saying. There's nothing wrong with doing natural science. I love natural science. Jonathan is a scientist. This is not the place where we're trying to dump on natural science.
No.
But if you're looking,
and Tim, too, if I may, I grew up it was called the Chemical City. There were more PhD scientists where I grew up, where I was born, Midland, Michigan, than any non-university town in America. I'm with you on that.
Yeah. But when we're talking about what is detectable by a method that is set up to detect natural causes, that's kind of like asking what you can do with a metal detector. If I get a metal detector, I can find the studs in my wall. I can find little scraps of metal that people have dropped on the beach. I may occasionally even find something bigger like a watch, but it's always going to be metal stuff. If I'm wondering where I mislaid my plastic comb and I go searching for it with my metal detector and I don't find it, I'm not going to conclude that the comb doesn't exist because the metal detector doesn't pick it up. Your methods may be great at finding certain kinds of things and just not the right kinds of methods for finding other real things. We have to be flexible enough about this to try to say, all right, we're just looking for good evidence. We don't want to do special pleading, but we don't want to do special pleading in the other direction either. So to limit yourself to just what can be detected as physical is to limit yourself to not detecting non-physical things and realities if they are really there. And a rule of thinking that would make it impossible for me to know a certain kind of truth if it were really true is an unreasonable rule.
Let me also add that the kind of evidence that Loftus is talking about there actually can be relevant to detecting non-physical entities and even to a theistic conclusion. So, for example, if you read Colin Heemer, he'll be talking about inscriptions. So you want archaeology, get the Book of Acts and the study of Hellenistic history. It's amazing. So you'll have inscriptions that show us things about different provinces in Asia Minor and so forth. And then you go and you read the Book of Acts and it implies the same thing about the language or whether something was in the same province, whether it was in a different province, or the names that were used or what gods were worshipped or that kind of thing. And so this shows the reliability of the Book of Acts, which in turn is pertinent to the reliability of Luke, which in turn is pertinent to the resurrection accounts in the book of Luke, which in turn is pertinent to the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, I am not saying, please, I know skeptics are going to go out there. Lydia just said that because there's an inscription somewhere in Asia Minor that this means Jesus rose from the dead. I just said is pertinent too, okay? But that there is a line by which we actually have data from archaeology that does tend to confirm a religious conclusion. And in the same way, for example, not to go way off topic, but the data concerning the DNA in the cell, for example, is certainly pertinent to a religious conclusion. So there's all kinds of ways in which we can even, I'm not going to say accept Loftus's limitation, but simply say, oh, great, you want to talk about stuff that I can look at under a microscope or stuff that I can look at on an inscription. Well, yeah, we got that too, so it's all going in that direction.
Okay, so let me continue. His second question that he wants to ask, do you also differentiate between evidence that directly confirms what you believe from evidence that's merely consistent with what you believe? Even if we accept that the body of Jesus might be missing, that doesn't prove he was raised from the dead, not by a long shot.
Does anyone say it does?
No.
I mean,
prove and confirm. Prove is one thing. Confirm. You use confirm and you use prove, and you've got two epistemologists, somebody who's really interested in this stuff, and a scientist, all in the panel, and they're going to go, oh, they're going to start face palming. I see Tim's double face palming. He needs more hands to do more face palms. Okay. And Loftus is trying to say that something that doesn't prove also doesn't confirm. That's not true. So, I mean, that's where Tom was bursting out, didn't anybody say it proves it? But to confirm, somebody brought up Richard Swinburne earlier, is to make something more probable than it would be without it. That's a sort of a general definition of confirmatory evidence, that if we didn't have this evidence, it would be less probable than when we do have this evidence. And then you can have it be even, we can even say strongly confirmed. Certainly if Jesus' body was not there, it does not logically entail that he rose from the dead. But it also definitely strongly confirms it, which is a lot more than merely being compatible with it, that there are 250 penguins currently on a certain ice floe in Antarctica is compatible with it, but neither confirms nor disconfirms, at least as far as I can see. So, but the absence of Jesus' body obviously does confirm.
Absolutely. And he goes on. So he asks a third question. Do you admit there's a distinction between ordinary claims and miraculous claims, and the ordinary claims don't require a great amount of quality evidence for them, whereas miraculous claims do? And this last distinction, just think of the virgin birth claim of Mary and the dream story of Joseph that convinced him she was telling the truth, along with the inclusion of his dream story into the Gospel of Matthew.
Okay, so there are non-miraculous claims that are less probable than many miraculous claims. So I could make one up right here. My aunt Ellen is currently winning a game of Scrabble with a final score of 432 while sipping mint tea with the tip of her nose, exactly 2.7 parsecs from the second largest asteroid in our solar system, which, etc. Right, I'll just go adding conjuncts onto this until I have something so ridiculously complex and improbable that it is less probable than that Jesus rose from the dead. It's just not true that you can park all of the supernatural claims at the low end of the spectrum and all the natural, non-miraculous claims at somewhere higher up on it and sort them that way. That's David Hume's dream. It is Bart Ehrman's dream, but it's just not true. So no, there is not in general that kind of a division. Now, that being said, may you ask legitimately for more evidence that a man rose from the dead than that he rose from bed this morning? Yes, absolutely. And the Christians have been saying this for a long time, since before David Hume. So if you look, for example, at Thomas Sherlock's book, The Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection, the advocate for the Christians there expressly says, yes, of course, you can ask for more evidence, but you can't demand more evidence than could in principle be given. That's unreasonable. Then you're placing it beyond the reach of evidence, and you're not asking to be responsive to evidence. You're instead asking for an excuse to not respond to the evidence. That's an illegitimate move.
Christians have been saying for a long time that this is an amazing thing. And I believe there's a famous passage by G.K. Chesterton about this. Oh, yes, there is something a bit odd about a virgin conceiving. No kidding, we have said, bring it on. What we Christians have said is, yes, our claims do require a lot of evidence. And if we got a show for you, we have the evidence. We are ready to present the evidence. So as far as any reasonable claim that, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, when you make it reasonable, like Tim was distinguishing a reasonable claim of that kind or a requirement from an unreasonable one, you make a reasonable one. And I don't believe that that's a question-begging thing to do. Oh, reasonable means something that I know I can satisfy, like I'm gerrymandering it or something, but just you're willing to be convinced by the evidence, then I think we've got that. I think we've got that covered. Whereas, quite frankly, there are miracle claims that may be even true. So, some of the things Craig Keener has researched, I'm not saying that they're false, but that some of those don't necessarily have the same level of evidence that the resurrection has for it. I don't believe every miracle claim that I hear. And nowhere close to it. I'm not saying Craig Keener does either. Don't misunderstand me. But what I'm just trying to say is, yeah, I'm all in favor of a certain amount of antecedent tough-mindedness, antecedent skepticism, if I may so put it, which we then allow ourselves to overcome if, in fact, the evidence warrants doing so.
And you used that word gerrymandering, Lydia. There's a sense almost in which I think John Loftus gerrymandered the question when he put in the point about the dreams. What kind of, are we accepting those based on, what kind of evidence do we have for those? Well, I don't know of anybody who starts there in defending the whole birth narrative. Nobody starts there. Yeah, I come to a confidence in the truth of that narrative after I come to a confidence in the truth in the whole. And that starts in places where I can reasonably start. Okay, we have a very, very reliable story here. I'll accept that as part of it. I don't start there. Why should I? And why should he expect us to? I think he picked something that he thought we would be embarrassed by. I'm not. I just don't start there.
Okay, so one point I also raised in my debate with Peter Atkins was that when people talk about extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, echoing that famous catchphrase or slogan from Carl Sagan, people typically understand that, or at least in the skeptical community, as having a single piece of spectacular evidence. But what can, in principle, be accomplished by one single spectacular piece of evidence can, in principle, also be accomplished by numerous pieces of weaker or insufficient evidences. And Peter Atkins didn't agree with that, and he dismissed that point completely. Said that there's no such thing as weak evidence.
Well, I think, what he may have been assuming is that you were talking about something that is so weak that it doesn't scarcely merits, being mentioned. And I know I tend to go, and I don't want to lose people with like talking mathy stuff, but something that, let's just put it this way, it's just virtually worthless. The way I would express that would be it scarcely has a top-heavy Bayes factor at all, because that's the way we talk around here. But another way to put it is that something that's just like, why even bother mentioning this? So I'll sometimes say the fact that I have not heard from a man named Henry Pumpernickel today is some evidence that Henry Pumpernickel does not exist. And in that sense, I've received evidence for an infinite number of claims today, because there's an infinite number of people who have not written email to me today. So in that sense, it's not even worth mentioning. And so I think probably when someone like Peter Atkins hears you say that, he thinks that you're talking about evidence that's not even worth mentioning. Okay. Whereas you're talking about something that has some amount of weight to it, but it's not sufficient all by itself to carry the weight. And then we can combine those into a cumulative case that's worth taking note of.
Maybe sufficient and insufficient evidences would be better nomenclature for that. But I also had one other point about the dream story in Matthew. So one evidence that one could adduce for that is the fact that Matthew's account is told exclusively from the perspective of Joseph, and Luke's account is told exclusively and consistently from the perspective of Mary, including what was going on in their respective minds at the time and so forth. And that is, very expected on the hypothesis that this is actually witness testimony that's going back, in Luke's case, to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and in Matthew's case, to Joseph, the father of Jesus. And so the fact that he's relating what was going on in his mind and the dream that he had and everything may well be consistent with that being grounded in reality as well. Okay. He says, so Loftus continues, he says, now for the question. Since you don't have any objective evidence that specifically confirms the miraculous resurrection of Jesus, and although the available scant of ancient testimonial evidence alone doesn't provide adequate grounds to confirm it, the testimonial evidence is based largely on hearsay testimony from just 2 or 3 authors, what is the real reason you believe it?
Next.
The reason that we believe it is that we don't believe you, John.
Because I'm desperate, and I just have to have something to hold on to get me through the night, man. I mean, that's not a leading question at all.
Yeah, Christianity is just comforting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I've read the Sermon on the Mount. I've read Matthew 25. I've read the book of Revelation. It's not comforting. It's demanding. There are times it's comforting, and it certainly has kept me hopeful during the time of COVID. But no, it wouldn't be any comfort if I didn't think it was true.
That's right. That's right. There was a guy who wrote, his name was Sheldon Van Auken, and he had a correspondence with C.S. Lewis and became a Christian in that context. And Van Auken kept saying to Lewis, he reproduces these letters in his book, the name of which escapes me.
Severe Mercy.
Thank you, A Severe Mercy.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm afraid that I'm just wanting to be a Christian because it is, it's wish fulfillment. I wish so much for it to be true. And Lewis wrote to him and in essence said something to the effect, you probably actually have wishes on both sides. Would you really simply find this to be comforting if you believed it to be true? Wouldn't there to some extent be some things you wouldn't like about it if you believed it to be true? So Lewis said, just set all of that aside. Just set all of that motivist stuff aside and just examine whether it is true or not. And let's just go for that instead of hitting the person with an ad hominem. Even in a sense, Van Auken was doing an ad hominem on himself. Maybe I'm just wanting to believe this because, and that kind of thing. And Lewis said it's worthless from an evidential point of view. Set that aside and look at the evidence.
I believe it's John Lennox who has this marvelous line. He's responding to something Dawkins once said to the effect that religion is a bunch of fairy tales that people tell themselves when they're afraid of the dark. And Lennox responded, well, I could equally well say that atheism is a collection of fairy tales that people tell themselves when they're afraid of the light. But that's really not to the point either way. Let's just move forward and look at the evidence.
Joshua Swamidas says, what has been the most important academic work or evidence regarding the resurrection that has come out in recent years? Why was it important?
I would say that the work that immediately comes to mind is the work by N.T. Wright, The Resurrection of the Son of God.
Yeah.
That is a massive piece of work. It's 2003, I believe, so not super recent. But the study of Jewish expectations regarding resurrection and the afterlife was done with great sophistication and sensitivity to primary sources. And I think Wright's book still sets a high watermark in that respect. So I would say on that front, that's the work that, to my mind, really is the biggest thing to have come out in the past couple of decades.
There's a shorter, simpler version for people who don't want the full 700 pages. I have it right next to me. Writes The Challenge of Jesus. He covers some of the same ground. I highly recommend it. And his chapter on the resurrection is a nice condensation.
An anonymous attendee asks, what are your thoughts on Greg Cavan's case against the resurrection, i.e. that the explanatory power of the resurrection hypothesis drastically drops because of the vague type of supernatural body that Jesus rose in, thus not explaining why Jesus' body disappeared, how he could transcend the standard model of particle physics, etc., without adding a bunch of ad hoc assumptions such that heaven exists and that glorified immortal bodies exist?
Why is that ad hoc?
Kevin's been trying to push this line now for quite some time, and I just don't, I really don't see that he has an argument here. We're not really talking about some kind of chance violation of massive quantum mechanical or thermodynamic probabilistic arguments. We're talking about a miracle. Yeah, he rose from the dead, and that would have pretty much have had to have been a miracle if it happened at all. We grant that. You can use those sorts of considerations as arguments that this did not happen by chance. This didn't happen from purely natural causes. But the question of whether those causes were the only things operating is a totally different question, and you can't get the same kind of numbers there that you can for saying, well, if natural causes were the only things operating, then of course we wouldn't expect a resurrection. Yes, no kidding, Sherlock, of course, that's true. But that's just the wrong way to think about this, and I can't think of any significant Christian thinker in the past 2,000 years who has said that it was.
It's been a number of years since I've read Cavan's paper, because it's gone through a few different incarnations, as it were. But the version that I read, my recollection is that, and Tim can correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that he's seeming to imply that the Christian must have a highly specific theory of the nature of Jesus' resurrection body. And then that belief in R, that Jesus rose from the dead, or belief in Christianity, has to then be conjoined with this highly specific theory of the nature of Jesus' resurrection body. And then that we have to say, well, what's our independent evidence for that highly specific theory about exactly what his body was like and how it could, go to heaven, the Ascension, or how it could go through walls or whatever, why people couldn't recognize him, all these kind of things. And, that's just really not true. I mean, it's a sort of a simple example would be that, if I say, the mailman brought the mail to my house today, that doesn't mean that I have to have a highly specific theory of what the mailman looked like. There are several different mailmen and mail ladies who deliver the mail to my house. I don't know which one delivered the mail to my house, but I heard it go thunk through the door, and there it was, and we got it. And, I can tell you some of the bills or whatnot that came today. I don't have to don't have to commit myself to the exact gender and height of the mailman in order to say that the mail came today. And so in the same way, to say that Jesus rose from the dead, we have a disjunction, you know, of various possible ways that his body might have operated, or the way it might have worked, or what exactly it meant for him to go to heaven. You know, was it a different space-time continuum? Did he go through a wormhole, or whatnot? Was it a miracle every time he went through a door, or was it that his body just naturally was able to go through doors? How is it that his body is never going to die? Does it continually renew, or whatever? You know, it's like writing science fiction, right? And we can all have fun writing science fiction of what the afterlife is going to be like, and what our bodies are going to be like, what Jesus' body is going to be like. The fact is, we don't know. And to try to saddle the Christian with the task to come up with one particular theory of exactly how all that worked for Jesus' body, and then say, look how improbable it is when you commit yourself to this highly specific theory, is just incredibly artificial and special pleading, and is not something that we would apply to millions and millions and millions of day-to-day things that we all believe.
I doubt if there's one person in 100,000 who can tell you in quantum mechanical detail why the sky is blue, why those particles there scatter those wavelengths of light preferentially all the way down to a deep level. This does not make us reject their testimony that the sky is blue. That's just not required. That's a bizarre requirement. I don't know why anyone would think it is.
Here's an interesting question from an anonymous attendee. How do the special characteristics of Jesus, i.e. his huge influence on human history, sinless life, etc., raise the probability that God may want to raise Jesus in particular? Couldn't it be said that the God of the Bible tends to work miracles on the lowly and the unknown?
Jesus kind of was unknown before he rose from the dead. I mean, if he hadn't risen from the dead, he'd be unknown to most people to this day. So I actually do think the Christian story tends to show that very same pattern. In fact, that's part of what answers another question skeptics will ask, which is, why don't we have non-Christian records of Jesus' miracles? You know, I don't think the Roman historians were out there concerning themselves so much about what was happening there. So that's kind of an odd thing. It's not as though, in fact, it says, behold, thy king comes unto the meek and lowly and riding upon an ass. And so Jesus actually does show that kind of turn that God makes in history, that he takes a Jewish rabbi and carpenter who rides on an ass rather than on a horse, and dies a very ignominious death, the death of slaves, and he raises him from the dead. So I see a confirmation of that pattern there.
Okay. This one's from Brian Pollock. He says, why do we not emphasize what Jesus told the disciples on the road to Emmaus, i.e. the best Bible study ever, the fact that he repeated the best Bible study ever with them and opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures? Then Acts 1 then tells us that over the next 40 days, Christ provided many convincing proofs that he was alive and spoke about the kingdom of God. Blue-collar, working-class guys then knew more than the Pharisees. Not quite sure what he's getting at.
Yeah, I'm having a little trouble getting the point of the question. Is, you know, is it that we complicate the answers too much? Is it that we just miss something there in the end of Luke?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe Brian could...
I'd love to know what Jesus said there. I mean, you know, I'm sure many preachers. I know Tim has often said that his father has said this. You know, I wish I could have been there. I wish I could have heard what he said. And if we had that, we would certainly have many sermons preached on it. But all that God has chosen to give us, for whatever reason, or all that the evangelists have chosen to give us, is a summary.
One thing from Acts 1 verse 3 about the many convincing proofs, I'll just throw in for free, is that the common, way too common atheist trope is that faith is believing without evidence, or faith is believing without proof. Acts 1:3 says that Jesus presented himself alive to them with many convincing proofs. If faith was belief without proof, then what Jesus did there was the most faith-killing thing he could have done, because he gave them if you know it, it's not faith. Oh, well, now we know it. It can't be faith. Well, okay, that's absurd. It's almost too absurd for me to explain it in an understandable way to explain how absurd it is. Faith is not belief without evidence. Jesus was not a faith killer. Jesus gave evidence because that built faith. That's a little off topic, but since someone mentioned it.
Rob asks, if the Trinity was false, would the resurrection make sense of anything?
Well, there were Socinians. Socinians, of course, don't believe in the resurrection. And they were, oddly enough, some of the strongest defenders of
what
the
you mean is they don't
resurrection.
believe in the Trinity.
Oh, I misspoke. I'm sorry. Misspoke. Yes, they don't believe in the Trinity, but they were very strong defenders of the resurrection. Now, in the context of Jesus' claims to deity, I think they had a hard row to hoe to believe in the resurrection and not believe in the Trinity. So I do think that there was some tension in their view, and I'm not saying they were entirely consistent if they tried to take all of Scripture into account. But in theory, you could argue for the resurrection without accepting the Trinity. In principle, you could.
Sir Anthony Buzzard, for example, is a big advocate of defending the resurrection, and yet he's a biblical Unitarian, whom I've done a webinar with in the past. And I've done a debate with his son-in-law, Carlos Xavier, on the Trinity. But the Trinity is, I think, very explicit. I think we all agree it's explicit in the New Testament. I would also argue that you can make a good case for it in the Old Testament as well. So I think that if you're taking the Bible seriously and taking it holistically, I think you have a very hard time denying the Trinity.
And if I'm still not sure that they might argue for the resurrection as Unitarians. I'm still not sure how it makes sense of anything. So my answer to his question would be probably it doesn't make sense, but we can move on.
Okay. Tim B says, how strong do you think the historical evidence is for the Ascension event? It seems to me that it could be a really strong part of a cumulative case. Well, we have the testimony of Luke in the book of Acts, and also in Luke 24. And Luke was someone who had access to the primary eyewitnesses. And since Luke proves himself to be a very reliable historian, especially in the book of Acts and also in the Gospel of Luke, we can therefore, since he's built up a track record of being a habitual truth teller and being a very reliable reporter, we have then, I think, good grounds for trusting him in his reportage of the Ascension that he talks about in Acts chapter 1.
Let me also point out that, and I just read N.T. Wright saying this in Resurrection Son of God last night, and others have made the same point, that the Ascension is actually, in a sense, necessary as a corollary of the physicality of the resurrection. When you put it together with the fact that in other parts of the New Testament, Acts would be one, but so too would be the Pauline epistles, Jesus is not taken to be walking around at that time. So I believe Wright says something like, Paul says that 500 at once saw Jesus, but Paul does not say, and you too can see Jesus. He doesn't write to the Corinthians and say that they can have the same experience that those 500 people had. What he's trying to say is that those 500 people had a certain experience because Jesus was physically present on the earth at that time, but he assumes in the whole context of his writing that Jesus is no longer physically present on the earth. And this is assumed all over the place in Acts. Of course, Acts also narrates the Ascension, but it's a coherent picture that we find in all of the epistles as well, that Jesus is no longer there. And so where did he go? If he rose from the dead physically and he was there for a while and now he's not there anymore, apparently they're not just talking about some kind of emotional experience. And at that point, you can, in a sense, infer an ascension or some kind of, leaving this space-time continuum because he's not around anymore. And so in a sense, that argues for the physicality of the resurrection accounts. And then on the other hand, when we have evidence that they testified to a physical resurrection, it kind of then makes sense that they would also have him not being here anymore at some point, because he manifestly wasn't there when they were testifying on the day of Pentecost.
There's two aspects of the ascension also, which I think point powerfully to the deity of Christ. In case there's any Unitarians or deity of Christ skeptics in our audience. One is in Luke 24, when it says in verse 52 that they worshipped him, having worshipped, literally, so it's proskunesiantes, which having worshipped him, and proskuneo, the Greek word proskuneo, can refer to worship in the sense of reverence, or kissing one's hand out of respect, or bowing in reverence, or something like that. But in a religious context, it means to worship as to a god. And the religious context is established here in Matthew 24 as Jesus has already ascended. So it's not like they're kissing their hand or kneeling at his feet or something. But the religious context is established by the fact he's already ascended to heaven, verse 52, and they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And the other aspect, which points to the deity of Christ, I alluded to briefly earlier, is in Acts chapter 1. It actually says in describing the ascension that the angels tell the disciples, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come the same way as you saw him go into heaven." Verse 12, then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, as Sabbath day's journey away. So the ascension takes place on the Mount of Olives, and when the angels tell the disciples, this Jesus will return the same way you saw him go, in other words, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which alludes, I think, back to Zechariah 14, where Yahweh's feet touch the Mount of Olives at the descent. To save the people of Israel. Okay. David Gadbois, this is probably a good question for Tim. He asks, who has the best resolution of the Quirinius census issue? Oh, you're muted, Tim.
Yeah, the simplest thing to say, besides just saying I have a YouTube video where I do a lot of this, go see it, is to say there are actually several not implausible resolutions of this issue. Let's just start with level 0. Suppose that Luke, referring to an event that may well have been something before he was even born, got his wires crossed. I don't think that's true, but suppose it was. Does that really make him a poor interviewer of living eyewitnesses to the resurrection, which is an event that lay within his lifetime? No, that does not. That wouldn't follow at all. But then let's go forward. One possible response is that prote just means before. You can press adjectives into use as adverbs and vice versa, and there are some examples even from the Septuagint. That's not what I would take as my sort of odds-on favorite, but that's a very simple resolution. Could also be, and this I think does have a measure of support even within Luke's other book, the Book of Acts, that he's using agenata to mean something more than just was. He could just use ein in Greek if he wanted to say was, but that he's saying that this enrollment, this signing up, was a multi-stage thing, and it got put on hold. And then when Archelaus was deposed for mismanagement and Quirinius became officially the legate, the governor in Syria, that process of taking the census was put, and the taxation consequent upon it was set back into motion. And this is actually very similar to the language that Luke uses in Acts chapter 11, where he's talking about a famine that eventually took place. He uses the same verb, agenata, during the reign of Claudius. So there are several different ways of looking at that one. I really don't think, if I were a skeptic, I don't think I would repose any confidence in that particular objection. I would want to look elsewhere.
Do you guys want to take one more question, or are we ready to wrap up now? Or
I'll do the one. I see one here from Cody Nelson on the argument that the evidence for there being magic at the Salem witch trials is comparable and or better than the evidence for the resurrection.
Okay.
No, it isn't. That's silly. The evidence that was given at the Salem witch trials was spectral evidence. That is to say, the very misbehaved children who gave the primary evidence claimed not that they had seen things that other people could see, but that they right there saw things other people could plainly tell weren't there. Specters that were tormenting them in various ways, and the children fell down and frothed at the mouth. And it was all stuff that people looking on could plainly see that was not before their own eyes. So no, that's just not true. And they were even warned initially by a minister, do not accept spectral evidence. This is not the appropriate kind of evidence. And they ignored that. And that's why they got themselves all tangled up. It's just false to say that the kind of evidence that was presented at the Salem witch trials was in any way, shape, or form comparable to the evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus. It wasn't even the sorts of things that were open to the eyes and ears of ordinary people sitting right there. People let themselves be yanked along into the epistemological abyss by the antics of these children, and people died as a result. That's tragic, but it says nothing about the evidence for the resurrection, nothing whatsoever. There's a nice book by John Fiske, by the way, a skeptic, on the Salem witch trials, called Witchcraft in Salem Village, I believe. And Fiske is very, very explicit on this point and scathing in his description of the kind of spectral evidence that was accepted in these trials.
Excellent. So thanks, guys, for being on. It was a really great panel discussion. Really enjoyed it. And we had some really great interaction with those questions that were submitted. And thanks for everyone that submitted questions. And look forward to running more of these webinars in the future.
Thank you for having us, Jonathan. And I want to emphasize that we've gotten into a lot of nitty-gritty here tonight, and I know there's going to be people who are going to say, well, I wasn't interested in that one, or I wasn't interested in that one, and that's fine, you know, that's understandable. But look at the big picture, you know, which is that the disciples attested to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, and they went out there and they put their lives on the line for that. And you know, it happened a long time ago. I'm not going to tell you Jesus is going to come right now and walk with you and talk with you and tell you that you're his own. But I am going to tell you that you have a reason to trust him and to believe in him, you know, whatever's going on in your life right now. So feel free to make contact with us. Any of us, I think, would want to hear from people who are genuinely seeking to know the truth on this topic, because God says, if you seek me with all your heart, you will surely find me. And so I truly believe that is true. So I just want to encourage you all in the audience and anybody who watches this, and I want to wish you all a happy Easter too.
Well, thanks so much. And if you guys tune in to Unbelievable on Saturday, I have a debate airing for Easter weekend on the resurrection topic.
With whom?
David Johnson. He's not especially well known. This is the one that was recorded in January, which it just hasn't aired yet. But he has a skeptics podcast called Seekers and Skeptics.
And happy Easter to you, Jonathan, and to all of my fellow panelists.
Thank you. Same to you.
Cool.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been great.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Night.